This just in, recently unknown information about realism has just been released to the press.
During the realism movement, many other social movements occurred which changed the society and culture from which realism emerged. One of these societal movements was the Second Industrial Revolution, which resulted in urbanization, an influx of European immigrants, competition between manufacturers, and the loss of traditional and rural values. The American mindset was changed to one of time efficiency and productivity. The rise of popular culture also broke down traditional values and was facilitated by the first transcontinental railroad. Another important movement of the time was the Reconstruction era. Recently emancipated slaves suffered through the Jim Crow laws and began the movement which would develop into the Harlem Renaissance and included early jazz music. The Homestead Act and the movement westward also contributed to the values of society at the time. Native Americans and Latinos began a struggle to survive in the United States as the empire expanded westward and the Western Front was no longer seen as mysterious and unpredictable. The modern scientific revolution also affected society. It advocated for the application of the scientific theory to all aspects of life. An important change during this time period was the growth of the income gap between the different economical classes and a rise in investigative journalism. It is important to note that realism became popular in the United States during the time period between the end of the Civil War and the beginning of the World War II.
Okay, so unlike most of the stories that most of you guys are used to reading, realism literature will usually consist of mostly character development and less plot development, mostly because they wanted their characters to be lifelike and real-like. So the readers can connect to characters in the story. Now, they will include lots of psychological concepts to better understand the character's mind and where they're coming from, as well as their background, to better understand their life and background. Now, they would usually try to get away from idealization and high-end poetic effects in their stories to keep it real and make it more believable. Now, just like in reality, events that occur in these stories are usually unpredictable, so it is very unlikely for anyone to predict what may happen in the next few pages.
So in the historical context of realism, things changed, and so did the United States. As the 19th century turned on and the country's immigrant population and working base grew, while simultaneously changes in history became life-altering. Machines were built, many of the industrialization around people had grown, and population had incredibly increased. Cities became a center of action, and ultimately this industrialization and urbanization led to major changes within the economy, within social changes, and this is a very important part. Because in this new world, there grew a greater divide between the rich and the poor. And for the first time, there was a larger literate working class population. And there was a need for literature and art that reflected their lives, these people's lives, their real lives. And just like any artistic movements, like any other isms, this movement was a reaction towards Romanticism and many of the other past isms. Within this ism, realism was more like an attack towards Romanticism, taking out this whole expressive emotional part and actually getting to the real deal. And basically, all we need to understand is that if you don't understand what realism is, then just remember what it's not. It's definitely not Romanticism.
Realism began during the Reconstruction era after the Civil War. This era was when President Andrew Johnson had to step up to the plate because President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. President Andrew Johnson was a Democrat, but he was the only senator to stay loyal to the Union during the Civil War. He had to deal with the Reconstruction of merging the North and the South back together because they had separated because of the Civil War. President Andrew Johnson's time, there was the radical Republicans who would not allow the Democrats back into the government because of the Civil War. The radical Republicans did everything they could to keep the Democrats out because they did not agree with their ideas and thoughts about how to run the government. It was not until Rutherford B. Hayes, the first Democrat to be president since the Civil War. He was the one who ended the Reconstruction era. After Hayes ended the Reconstruction, the following presidents were President James A. Garfield, Chester, Alan Arthur, Benjamin Harrison, Robert Cleveland, and Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was the last president near the middle of America. Theodore Roosevelt focused on playing peacemaker between the economy and the forces because he thought that that is what the government should be able to do.
So this is the philosophical beliefs of governing society. So first off, another definition of realism is the approach to the study and practice of international politics. It emphasizes the role of nation-state and makes a broad assumption that all nation-states are motivated by national interests. National interest is defined as all states seek to preserve their political autonomy and their territorial integrity. This emphasis on relative power derives from the realist conception of international system of an anarchical environment. The political realist fears centralized authority unless the authority is derived from the power of his or her own state. The decentralization of international system permits greater diversity than would be of an empire. The balance of power is the natural tendency of states to increase the power. The preservation of state autonomy is an important objective.
We will now return to Get Real with Andy and Brianna.